Greetings, everyone. This is the third lesson of our clobber passage verses. And so tonight we're going to be looking at Leviticus. We're actually going to be looking at 18:22 and 20:13. But because of the breadth of what we're looking at, this lesson will actually be divided into, it will be this lesson and then the next lesson. So, technically we're doing two verses, but because they are so intertwined, it's something that I want to keep them together, but technically they'll end up being separated. Anyway, you'll get it. Okay, so as we get started, the first thing that I think we need to look at in this Levitical passage is to understand better the structure of the book of Leviticus. Now, the book of Leviticus is actually set up with a common Jewish rhetoric type structure. And we call this the chiastic structure. And the word chi comes from the Greek letter chi. And this structure basically builds up. You have an A section, a B section, and then the C section, which is the primary, most important part, or the center. Some chiastic type structures have more than just the three sections. But anyway, the middle section is always the most important, and then you have a response to the B section and then the response to the A section. And this is very common in Jewish culture. This is very common in actual rhetoric, even English rhetoric to some extent. Now, it will seem very similar to what we learned in high school with plot of a story, where you have the introduction, then the rising action, then the climax, then the falling action, and the resolution. That's kind of the idea here, but the fourth section is going to mirror the second section. The fifth section is going to mirror the first section. So we'll talk more about this in a minute. So anyway, the whole book of Leviticus is set up like this. And it's very important for us to understand that this is a way of writing that the Jewish literary people used, and is very common throughout the entire Old Testament, and even some of the New Testament we see this being used. So the heartbeat, the main focus of this section, or of this book rather, is found in Leviticus 19:18. And it says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." And this is the pinnacle of the book of Leviticus. So everything in front of it builds up to this statement, love your neighbor as yourself, and everything after it falls away from that pinnacle. Now, why does this matter? This matters because everything that is in front and everything that is after all surround this one small point: love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I bet if you're like me, you didn't even know love your neighbor as yourself was from Leviticus 19. And I would dare say that the majority of people never hear that. And the book of Leviticus is very rarely used in sermons, except for sermons about homosexuality. Now, there are other reasons, certain sacrifices and things, and certain better to understand, biblical studies, things like that. But the vast majority of churches that teach from the book of Leviticus are focusing on verses similar to the clobber passages we're going to be looking at. They may also be looking at things like incest and lust and adultery. But overall, the vast majority of churches that focus on anything Leviticus are going to be focusing on the verses that we're looking at this week and next week. So tonight we're going to be looking at these two verses. Now, these verses have been lifted out to be weaponized against the LGBTQ people. And we want to place them back in their literary context of the Holiness Code so that we can better understand how they fit in to the truth and ultimately to the message of the book itself. So, as you probably know, I tend to be one of those thinkers, so I wanted to demonstrate a little bit how this chiastic structure is used commonly. Now, there are many places in the Bible that it's used, and one of the first places is found in the Genesis flood story. And so you have the Genesis flood story. There's violence that's happening. Basically, God repents because he created humans. The ark is built, and it talks about the ark and then the coming of the animals. And then the waters rise, the flood, wash everything away. And then God remembers Noah. In the midst of all of this chaos, God remembers Noah. And then the waters recede, mirroring the waters rising. And then we look at the ark again. And then you have peace, which is the opposite of the violence. And each of these leads up to this one pinnacle moment of God remembering Noah. We look in the book of Ruth. Ruth, we have famine. Then we have loss, and Naomi loses her husband and her two sons. And her daughter-in-laws lose their husbands too, because they're her sons. Anyway, and then she tries to send them away, but there's loyalty, which is Ruth saying, I am not leaving you. And that's kind of the pinnacle moment. That's the turning point in the story. And that's another thing you can say is a turning point. And then we have the loss from the beginning is mirrored to restoration in the fourth section. And then the famine and lack in the beginning is mirrored to the fullness that they received when they returned and Boaz made them family and. So the entire story from start to finish actually build up to this turning point of Ruth saying, I will not leave you. You are blood of my blood, flesh of my flesh. I'm not going anywhere. Another common biblical example is parables. And we're going to look specifically at the prodigal son, but there are other parables that follow the same principle. But the beginning of the prodigal son, we have lost. He leaves home, goes. Then we see his descent into chaos. Then we see he hits the rock bottom. He hits that moment, and that turns his life. It's his turning point. And then he begins making his way back home, and now that which was lost becomes found. And the first and end mirror, the descent and the ascent mirror, and then that turning point in the middle where he hits rock bottom. And actually, if you think about it, instead of it building to a pinnacle, it kind of dips down to that pinnacle, or to the climax. Anyway, the book of Job is also a very common story, and I'm not here to discuss whether Job is or is not a real story. That's not the purpose of what I'm about to say, but it is important for us to understand that the book of Job is also a chiastic structure. So you have Job's suffering, and then Job's lament, and then you have the human speeches, and then the debate, and then God meets them in a whirlwind. And then where Job had debated with them, now Job is silent, mirrors the debate, and then God rebukes the friends, which mirrors the human speeches, and then Job's suffering and lament is mirrored in his restoration. And so each of those different sections come against or is kind of an answer to the beginning. Okay. Also, Jewish literary examples. We see this in the overall non-religious side of the Jewish examples. So you see it in things like Hebrew poetry, and you see a lot of it in the parallelism. You see it in the Talmudic argumentation, And if you've ever seen on a movie where rabbis are talking, they usually sound like they're arguing and they're yelling at one another, but really there's this way of structure that they have. They make a statement, then there's the objection, then there's the resolution. Then there's the counter objection, and then the reaffirmation. And so the beginning is mirrored in the end. Greco Roman examples, the Odyssey. The Odyssey begins with this big departure, they're leaving, and then they go through trials, and then there's this big pinnacle revelation that happens, and then they go back through more trials, and then they finally return home. Greek tragedy, the stories of like Icarus and other Greek tragic heroes. There's this rise, and it looks great, and then there's this moment of hubris, which is pride. It's arrogance, and then there's the fall, and then there's the recognition of what has happened, the fall being the turning point. Then there's the recognition about the pride and the arrogance, and then finally that rise is mirrored in the restoration. Modern day examples, The Lion King. We start out with Pride Rock. Then Simba gets sent into exile because they blame him for his father's death. Then there's the transformation, Hakuna Matata. Then there's that return home, which mirrors the exile. And then at the very end of the story, you see Pride Rock again, and it's mirroring the beginning. And actually, it literally is, because in this second time that Pride Rock is shown, it's now Simba's children that are being honored. Star Wars: A New Hope starts out in the desert. Then they go through space. Then there's the scene where they're at the trench and they're trying to go through all of the things that happen there. And then they're back in space, and now they find themselves back in the desert, but this time it's completely different transformation. Their minds have changed. Luke Skywalker is a completely different person, basically. Speeches use this. If you've ever had to give a speech in speech class, we normally, you have this introduction to rising action, then you have the climax of what you're trying to say, then you have the falling action and the restatement of the thesis. Comedy. When you hear people making or trying to be live action or live comedy in a comedy club or something, there's typically the setup building up to it, then there's the twist, and then there's the punchline, and then there's a final twist, and then callback to the beginning. So all of this is chiastic structure, and we see it everywhere. We see it everywhere we look. There's not a place in literature that we do not see this form. So all of that being said, the book of Leviticus is set up in this way. The focus was never on a particular verse in the first half or the second half, like the church has a tendency to pick and choose those verses. It was never focusing on that. The focus was strictly on love your neighbor as yourself. And sadly, that's usually the thing that people don't even mention in the book of Leviticus. So when was the book of Leviticus written? I guess technically we're not to this slide yet, but when was the book of Leviticus written? So the book of Leviticus was written and shaped over thousands of years. It wasn't a single author, it wasn't a single moment. The book reflects the priestly tradition. And if you remember, Leviticus comes from Levites, and Levites were the priestly group of people, the priestly tribe of Israel. And they were the group of theologians, scribes, ritual experts, and they preserved and organized Israel's worship practices. So the Levites, the Levitical sect, they formed all of these little things that they had learned throughout history and put it together in a book. Now, You've probably heard it said that this is a book of Moses. That does not mean that Moses wrote it. It is a book that mentions Moses, that talks about things that were going on during the time of Moses, possibly, but nowhere in it does it say that it was strictly written by Moses. Sorry, that's just the way it is. And my dad is um, a big believer in it being written by Moses. He's also an inerrantist, so he believes that the Bible is without error. I don't believe that, but that's beside the point. And so most biblical scholars believe that Leviticus was shaped over this thousands of years, from the time of Abraham all the way through till the time when it was actually put down. Now, most people think that this was written, most common average Christians think that this was written during the the 40 years prior to entering into the Promised Land. However, most likely it was not written until the late 7th century BCE, maybe even as late as the 6th and 5th century BCE. See, if you remember from 2 Kings 22 and 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35, there was a king by the name of Josiah. And Josiah saw that they weren't honoring God. And he decided that he wanted to reclaim the temple, basically. And he goes in, and it tells us in those chapters in Kings and Chronicles that he sends people into the temple, and they're going through the temple, and they find scrolls. Well, basically, they found laws. They found things from previous generations. And so it is believed, as proposed, that either they took all of those laws and formed them together into what became Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, or they had all of this parchment that they'd found, and ultimately in the 6th and 5th centuries, when they were taken into Babylonian exile, which is in 2 Kings 24-25 and 2 Chronicles 36, that they actually pieced everything together while they were in Babylonian exile. I tend to focus on the latter just because there was so much time during the Babylonian exile that the people had, that they could have put this together, and it would have been much easier for them to formulate all of this law and code during the time that they were in exile. And so it probably was not something that happened, or at least in my opinion, probably was not something that happened during the reign of King Josiah. It was something that happened shortly after, when they were actually removed into Babylon. Now, one thing I do want to point out, one of the big reasons that they ended up being removed to Babylon was because they weren't doing what ultimately that pinnacle of Leviticus says: love your neighbor as yourself. Because they basically had abandoned the foreigner, basically had abandoned the hungry, the lost, the one in prison, the child, the widow. And Amos is writing to the northern kingdom, so he's writing to the 10 tribes above Judah. But if you read through Amos, you'll see that there's horrible stuff going on in the northern kingdom. And most likely, if that was going on in the northern kingdom, it's also going on in the southern kingdom, which the southern kingdom is Judah and Benjamin. Okay, why is this important? Well, this means that Leviticus took shape during a specific time in Israel's history. It was a time where they were losing their land, they were losing their temple, they were losing their cultural identity, and they were trying to understand how to remain God's people in the midst of crisis. So the verses that we read in Leviticus is actually a response to all of this loss. The loss of land, the loss of temple, the loss of identity. And the temple is important because that's the loss of central religion, their cultural identity, as well as them being able to understand how to serve God in the midst of crisis. So the book is focused on three things: identity, distinctiveness, and holiness. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, as you can tell from the slide. So who wrote it? Now, the traditional view says that Moses wrote it, and people call this the Book of Moses. I already mentioned that, but just because I have it in my notes. But the scholarly view says Leviticus is most likely written by the priestly writers. And these are the individuals that we see, these are the individuals that we see writing the priestly parts, the poetic parts of the other books. So these writers, these priestly sources, priestly writers are found, their information, their text is found through the books of Exodus, Numbers, and Genesis. And if you have ever read anything about the actual authorship of the Pentateuch, you'll see that there's the Jehovahist and the priestly writers that they have. Anyway, so the Levites were the priests. These are the temple theologians, the ritual specialists, the scribes. They were the ones most likely that were piecing all this together. Now, why does this matter? Well, because they were the priests, they weren't moral philosophers. They didn't focus on moral philosophy and humanitarian issues. They focused on ritual, worship, identity, and how to set their lives apart from everyone else. So they weren't writing a universal moral ethics. Instead, they were looking strictly at the holiness of the people. And the holiness of the people is their focus. And we find that in what we call the Holiness Code. The Holiness Code actually sets up several things, and it lays out for them what they felt like they needed in times to be truly set apart for God. So one of the first things we need to do is discuss holiness. What is holiness? Well, holiness basically means to be set apart. The Greek version of holiness also means to be set apart. Everything, it's not this contemporary Christian conservative view of holiness that gives you this place, this identity that you're better than everybody else, which the Bible talks very much against that. The entire New Testament Gospels, Jesus is talking against the sects who were trying to build holiness as being greater than everybody else. But there are a lot of people that's what they think holiness is. And holiness in the Bible is not holiness that we see in the modern culture or the modern church. So the book itself is actually set up with chapters 1 through 7 being the rituals of sacrifice, 8 through 10 being priestly ordination, and then 17 through 26 is that holiness code. And it deals with things like purity and stuff like that. Then we get to 21 through 22, which deals with the priestly holiness, and then 23 through 27, which deals with the worship and festivals. So the beginning, the rituals and sacrifice, the end, worship and festivals, the middle section, the priestly ordination and how to declare priests, and then what the priests have to do, their holiness, and then that middle section focusing on ultimately purity, holiness, and love. The hinge point of the book of Revelations, the book of Leviticus. I hope I didn't say that any other place in here. Hopefully not. So anyway, the hinge point of the book of Leviticus is the Holiness Code. And it's basically where the Jewish leaders created a code or a set of rules that they believed would set them apart as God's distinct people. Now, the way the book presents it is that these words came directly from God's mouth. And sadly, that's what many modern day conservative Christians believe. That the Bible, that the words in Leviticus came exactly what God said, and spoke it to them, and this is how it was going to be. But we're talking about things that were written down over time, and then they were compiled at this one specific time in history. So there's really no way that God could have actually sat them down and said, okay, these are what I want you to put. Because this was something that was pieced together through generation after generation, beginning with being spoken from one person to another, from generation passed down to their kids and then grandchildren, great grandchildren. And so the people, they basically had to piece all this together, put it all together. Now, repeated throughout this is the refrain, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." So let's talk about holiness. Let's see what my next slide is. Okay, we're not there yet. Yes, we are. We're there. Okay, so the Hebrew word for holy is kadosh, and it does not mean morally perfect. It simply means set apart. The Greek version also means set apart. Neither the Old Testament or the New Testament did holiness ever mean morally perfect. It never meant that they had a perfect moral, ethical system. Instead, it means to be set apart, marked off, different, distinct. It never meant perfect. It never meant morally flawless. And it never meant spiritually elite, which is what we see in the modern day Christian version of holiness. When you hear people talk about holiness, you read books about holiness, it's all about being this perfectly person that is outside of any sin, outside of any moral issue. And that actually began in the New Testament whenever we see people like the Sadducees and the Pharisees who thought they were better than everybody else, who would stand on the street corners with their sackcloth and ashes and mourn, and everyone would look at them and say, oh, they're mourning, they're worshiping God in this way, they're worshiping God in that way. And we see that in the New Testament, this idea of being set apart and distinct turned into this concept of being perfect, being morally flawless, being spiritually and socially elite. It moved away from being identity driven to being superiority driven. And another word that's found in the Hebrew is the word kadash, kadash, which is sanctified. Again, sanctified is very closely related to holy, because sanctified is actually the concept of something being set apart for God. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. If holiness meant to be spiritually and morally elite, why didn't we see that in the believers of the Old Testament? Because if you think about it, there were very few, if any, that showed any type of morally eliteness. I mean, you think about Abraham. Abraham was not a good person. Abraham lied consistently. Abraham lived a life to where he easily was convinced to go have a child with his wife's maidservant. And he was, he did some good things. God honored him. He was a friend of God, as it tells us in the New Testament. But Abraham was not overly good. If you've ever thought about the story of Ruth, Ruth was not morally the best person in the world. Ruth actually broke the common modern day view of no sex before marriage type relationship. Ruth, it actually tells us that Ruth went into Boaz before they were actually married. I mean, people leading up to the birth of Christ, you have a woman that is believed to be a prostitute in the lineage of Christ. The Old Testament is not a bunch of morally elite people. David is probably one of the worst people in the entire Bible. Um, but David had a heart after God. So David made a lot of really bad mistakes. David had a man killed because he was scared of being found out, getting the guy's wife pregnant. David numbered the people when God said not to. There's all of these things that David did in his life that were against what God said. But David did some really good things too. So when we look at, think about a prophet like Elisha. Okay, Elisha had just seen Elijah, his master, taken away in a chariot of fire, and he crosses the River Jordan, and some kids make fun of him. What does he do? He calls down bears from the mountain, and they eat the kids. Okay, these people were not the best people. These people made really bad choices, really bad decisions. Jephthah in the book of the book of Judges, sacrificed his daughter because he promised God, I will sacrifice to you the first thing that comes to me whenever I get home if you give me this victory. And the very first thing wasn't a dog, it wasn't a cat, it wasn't a sheep, a goat, a cow, it was his daughter. And we don't read that story much. No, very few people actually read that story. So when you look at the Old Testament, there is no one there that is fitting the modern day concept of holiness, of being morally incorrupt. Instead, they were called to be separate. They were called to be distinct, as a distinct people. In the Old Testament, this applied to the people. This applied to objects that they used. This applied to spaces like in the temple or in the tabernacle. It applied to certain times, as in the Sabbath or holy days. It applied to certain rituals, as in sacrifices to God in this way or that way. And then identity markers. And it was not about being better than anyone else. It was about being distinct for a reason. Holiness is about belonging. It's about being visibly different from the nations around them. And that's what the Holiness Code tells us. The Holiness Code marks Israel as distinct. It protects Israel from assimilating into the pagan cultures. It shapes Israel's communal life and reflects God's character in the nation, centering Israel's ethics around love and justice. Because we've already said, Leviticus 19:18 says, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so as we get into this next section, chapter 18, which chapter 18 is very important because that's where the first clobber passage is found in the book of Leviticus. So chapter 18 begins with this statement, do not imitate Egypt and Canaan. So do not imitate Egypt, which they knew Egypt because they had come out of Egypt, and Canaan was where they lived. They were surrounded by these other nations, the Ammonites and the Moabites and all of these other people that lived in the land of Canaan. Then it gives this long list of taboos. And then it gives a warning about exploitative sexual systems. And that's what we're going to focus on in a minute. Then it repeats the taboo practices and then again states, do not imitate Egypt and Canaan. So the end of the chapter 18 actually goes back and looks at the beginning. It mirrors the beginning. Now the center isn't about sexual orientation. Nowhere in the middle of Leviticus 18 does it mention sexual orientation the way we think of sexual orientation. It is about rejecting exploitative, hierarchical, dominated-based sexual practices that were common in the surrounding nations. And that's where Leviticus 18:22 appears. So during the Babylonian Empire, which is when most likely this was piece together. There were several sexual norms, and the Babylonian Empire went from 1800 BC through 539 BCE, or BCE. Um, they had a very complex sexual norm situation going on. And same sex behavior was not only known, but it was documented and socially varied. So, male on male sex occurred, especially in temple prostitution, cultic rituals, and hierarchical systems, meaning status based. And many times this was very exploitative, and that's very important for us to realize. Something that's interesting, though, is they had gender variant priests, and they called them gala priests. These are basically people who are non binary, people who didn't claim to be male or female, or they basically one day considered themselves male and the next day considered themselves female, and they had different roles. They didn't form, they didn't conform in the main gender roles we see today, that we think of today. The Babylonians did not criminalize consensual sex acts. And what mattered most to them was status, not gender. So, a free man, a man who was basically a citizen of Babylon, a free man, not a slave, he could dominate a slave. He could have sex with a temple prostitute. He could have sex with a servant. That was socially acceptable. But if a free man had intercourse with another free man, meaning penetrative intercourse with another man, because they were at the same level, that was considered shameful. So they would only do that as a way to cause shame on the other man. So they would have a sexual relationship with another free man for the purpose of causing humiliation to that other man. And this goes back to what we talked about in Genesis 19, where they were doing it as a form of humiliation. And so for the Babylonians, sexual acts were often tied to things like status, domination, and ritual. They were never tied to someone's orientation in life. The Persian Empire, which comes immediately after the Babylonian exile, and you remember the stories of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, who's a Babylonian king, he sees the writing on the wall, literally, and Daniel comes in to tell him what the writing on the wall means, and he tells him that he's cursed, and within moments, the Persians sweep in, and the reason that they were so cursed was because the sacred and holy implements from the temple were being used in pagan eating and drinking and things. And so the Persians swoop in, they take over the Babylonian Empire, and so during the time that Leviticus was being formulated, put together, was this crossover between the Babylonians to the Persians. And we learn by reading different Greek historians, and we say Greek because Greeks came after the Persians, so they wrote about the Persians, talked about same-sex relationships among the Persian men, especially those in courtly or military-type contexts. The Persian religion, called Zoroastrianism, focuses on purity versus impurity, but did not have an explicit ban on consensual male same-sex relationships. And then the Persian society included things like court favorites, which were basically men who were part of the harem. They were basically male concubines to the king. Gender variant individuals, so people who were considered non-binary, people who that would possibly wear clothes that were more masculine, but they were feminine, and more feminine and masculine, so there were those gender variant individuals. And the Persians were known for absorbing cultures, local sexual norms, all instead of setting strict prohibitions, they allowed people to continue living their life the way they always had. And so they just absorbed it into their culture. And we see this again with Rome. Rome does this. That's why the Jews had their own king, King Herod. That's why the Jews were not forced to take on all of the Roman rule. So when we read this passage in Leviticus 18:22, and we're coming to the end of our session for today, Leviticus 18:22, when we read this passage in the middle of the holiness code, we read, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." Now that is the NRSV, that's the New Revised Standard Version. Leviticus 18:22 uses a word, toev, and toev is often translated in modern day Bibles as being abomination. But toev doesn't even mean sin. The word itself literally means something that is culturally out of bounds. It's like a taboo. And we have taboos. We have things that we think of, oh, that's taboo. That's something that I really, it's not really wrong, but it's not something that I want to be involved in. That's what toev means. Or I keep saying that wrong. It's toeva. Toeva. Can't believe I was saying that wrong this whole time. Anyway, toeva. So toeva doesn't mean abomination. It doesn't mean sin. It doesn't mean something's wrong. It just means it's something that isn't culturally appropriate. It is basically like a boundary violation or something that is improper to a specific community in context. So the toeva is used to describe things like food, using mixed fabrics like cottons mixed with other types of fabrics, agricultural mixing, planting 2 crops in one field, the Egyptians refusing to eat with the Hebrews. And if you know anything about the Egyptians basically turned their back on the Hebrews and felt like they were not people. The use of idols, dishonest scales are taboo, and we think about that in the New Testament when Jesus is flipping over the tables in the temple. And then exploiting the poor is considered a taboo. It's considered toeva. Sowing discord, trying to cause trouble, stir up problems. And then prayers offered by someone who refuses justice. So justice is to be meted out, and these people refuse to accept that justice, and then the Bible says that them praying, basically, God doesn't hear. It's taboo, it's toeva. Not once is toeva used in a moral category. It is strictly a boundary breaking specific to the culture. So when Leviticus calls something toeva, we must ask, okay, is this out of bounds? In what sense? Is it a ritual out of bounds? Is it a cultural out of bounds? Or is it ethical out of bounds? And in Leviticus 18, the answer is ritual and cultural. Cultural meaning specific to the Jewish culture. Leviticus 18 sits in the middle of the Holiness Code and the identity-forming center of the book. And its purpose was to mark off Israel, and in this case, with chapter 18, specifically the sexual systems of the Egyptians and the Canaanites. And in the world of the Jewish people during this 5th and 6th century BC or BCE, we find that there was temple prostitution going on. There was status-based sexual domination, which we talked about just a moment ago, where a man would force himself on another man of the same level as a humiliation. But they were allowed to have sex with slaves, so hierarchical sexual practices, and then the ritualized act in fertility cults. And these practices were exploitative, they were patriarchal, and they were religiously charged. So Leviticus 18:22 calls for such acts toeva, calls them toeva, saying, do not imitate the exploitative sexual cult practices of the other nations. And it is not addressing a loving, mutual, consensual, same gendered relationship. It is addressing ritualized sex, hierarchical sex of one person bringing humiliation to someone else, or one person forcing themselves on these slaves. And then it was addressing pagan sexual systems, telling them that they needed to stay separate to keep themselves, their cultural identity, separate from these other nations. Now, because Leviticus is chiastic, the center interprets the edges. So the very center of this leads to this idea of love your neighbor. And that's what the purpose of this holy purity boundary that we run into is to teach them how to truly remain culturally separated from these other cultures in a way that they're showing love for their neighbor. So when modern translations say abomination, the Hebrew word doesn't mean abomination, doesn't mean sin, doesn't mean moral wickedness. It just means it's morally taboo. It's something culturally taboo, rather, something that's marked off. Okay, so before we move to verse 20, and verse 20 is going to be the next lesson, that before we get, or chapter 20, wow, before we move to chapter 20, I do want to mention the difference between morality and purity. So purity laws regulate identity, not ethics. Purity laws have nothing to do with ethics. So there really is no morality to the purity laws in the Old Testament. And this is very important because if it was a moral issue, if these purity laws were moral issues, then we would still have to be following food restrictions, clothing restrictions, agricultural mixing, the mixing of bodily fluids, being in contact with bodily fluids, contact with death, festival observances, and sexual taboos tied to pagan systems. So if these verses were actually talking about morals, talking about ethics, the morality of the people, then, and we were supposed to follow that in today's modern culture, we would have to follow all of these other restrictions. It was never about morality or ethics. It was strictly about identity. These laws were not about right or wrong. These laws were about Israel versus the surrounding nations. They make Israel holy, meaning set apart, not morally superior. Nowhere in it does it have anything to do with morality. It has to do with setting them apart so that they would not be confused with other nations. The only morality that we find in the book of Leviticus deals with things like justice, compassion, and righteousness. And when we read about these moral laws have to do with things that are good, things that are just, and loving another person. And the moral laws are prohibitions against things like murder and theft, oppression, the commands to take care of the poor, to treat workers fairly, to avoid slander and vengeance, and to love your neighbor. Those are moral things. The issue that we see with the sexual morality law or purity laws have nothing to do with ethics and morality. It has to do with purity and setting them apart. These laws, the morality laws, the murder and theft and caring for the poor and taking care of workers, those are universal across all cultures and eras. But purity laws were temporary. They only focus on the Jews. And that's why Christians eat things like shellfish. They mix their fabrics. We have polyester blends. They plant crops where they may have corn lined up right beside wheat. They ignore purity taboos. and they do not follow the Levitical penalties, which we're going to find out more about when we get to verse 20 or chapter 20. Christians do follow, though, statements like love your neighbor, be just to one another, walk humbly before your God, protect those who are vulnerable. So Leviticus 18 and ultimately 20 are purity laws, not moral laws. And that's very important for us to know and to recognize. This is where we will pick up later. This is where we will pick up in the next lesson. So I hope you have gained something from this and that it has helped you better understand what's going on in Leviticus 18. So thank you and God bless. Y'all have a good night.